Mastic has arrived. He's our third speaker. Right now, I'd like to introduce Stephen McInerney, the premier advocate in Washington, D.C. for assistance to Tunisia. He's executive director of the Project on Middle East Democracy, and it's our pleasure to have him here today.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks to CSID for putting on this event and for inviting me. I strongly agree with all the remarks that we've heard so far. I'll pick up a little bit where Alberto left off in terms of the importance of Tunisia as a model and importance of a successful democratic model in the Arab world. I would argue that the success of a democratic model in the Arab world, which certainly right now is most likely to happen in Tunisia, is every bit as important to the future of the region, in the long term, as the defeat of ISIS. I think that, unfortunately, in terms of priorities and the way that the region is perceived, the focus is always on the kind of immediate short-term threat rather than the importance of the long-term impact. And while I think that the support, international support and attention from the international community, and including especially from the United States, for Tunisia's transition to democracy and its successful consolidation of democracy should be viewed as a goal that's on par with the defeat of ISIS. Unfortunately, that's often not the case in terms of how it's viewed here in Washington. In addition to being goals of equal importance, I agree with previous comments that support for Tunisia should be a much more achievable, not an easier goal, but achievable with fewer resources and not the same scale of investment, but perhaps the same scale of attention and desire, and that the war against ISIS inevitably is going to have a strong military component, and military engagements are very expensive. I'll get in a few minutes to the kinds of support that I think is needed in Tunisia, but it's not that expensive. And I'll also speak in a few minutes to come back to this point about the funding and the recent Senate appropriations bill. But I think that the United States government should be able to find the level of funds that are needed to provide very important support to Tunisia. I'll also agree with the remarks that we've heard and can underscore the fact that not only is the success of democracy and the model that it could provide in Tunisia important, and I would argue as important as defeating ISIS, but they're also very intertwined. And as we've heard already, radical violent extremism benefits greatly. It takes its strength from closed political environments, from political repression, from environments that now allow no space for nonviolent political activity, for nonviolent political expression, and that forces their populations to turn to violence in order to express themselves or try to have a role politically. And I certainly do believe that's part of the reason that we have seen Tunisia targeted. I sometimes fear that this dynamic, the kind of symbiotic relationship between radical extremism and repressive authoritarianism, I sometimes fear that the radical extremists in the region understand this dynamic more than we do here in Washington, and that they understand that defeating successful democracy, so defeating the model of democracy that we're hoping to see consolidated in Tunisia, is essential to their strength and their survival. And unfortunately, we don't often see that here in Washington, that not only is support for Tunisia's democratic transition very important in its own right and the influence it could have in the future, but it's also should be seen as an essential component of countering violent radicalism and countering the Islamic State. This event today was framed in terms of how we can protect Tunisian democracy from the Islamic State, but it's important to remember that the success of Tunisian democracy is also a threat to the Islamic State itself. So having said all of that, what can the United States be doing to support Tunisia's democracy to help ensure that it is successful, because I think it is certainly the case that while Tunisia is really the only hope underway for a successful transition to democracy today, it's certainly not there yet. And there's still lots of dangers. Its democracy is a fragile one, and it must undertake many important steps itself. But I think outside support is also very important. There are three main areas in which Tunisia needs support from international actors and from the United States: security, the economy, and the sort of politics, the democracy and governance side. In terms of security, I think Tunisia does need security assistance from the United States. I think that security assistance from the U.S. Has been very helpful and very important, including some training of security forces. I think we've seen some real positive impact of training, of military-to-military training from the U.S. Department of Defense to the Tunisian military. What we haven't seen on the same scale is training and support for the Ministry of Interior and for the police forces. And I think we've seen the sort of deficits on that side, with the recent attacks. I'd like to see the same kind of training that the U.S. I think has been very effectively providing to the Tunisian military continue, but then also applied more to the police and to the Ministry of Interior, even though perhaps that's not as natural for the United States. Because we don't have the same kind of national police force. I think it's important to make sure that we're providing the kind of support that's needed and not just what's natural and easiest for us to provide. On the economy, there are lots of things that are needed on the economic side, and I think it's very important that Tunisia have economic success to accompany the political progress that it's made. Without that, the political progress and toward democracy that has been made in Tunisia and is very important, there's a risk of it being sort of tarnished in the eyes of its public. If we're at a point now where Tunisia has moved from authoritarianism to democratically elected government and a much freer environment for political discourse and political engagement, but it has not yet brought with it economic success. So I think, for the sake of the consolidation of Tunisia's democracy, it's very important that it have prosperity and economic success. In terms of things that the U.S. can do, certainly direct economic assistance, financial aid and support, as well as providing create programs to help with job creation, also programs to help sort of match the education and job training in Tunisia with the demands of the job market there, and especially in the interior, especially away from the coast, away from the capital. One of the reasons for the Tunisian revolution, which erupted and then, of course, spread across the region, was the disparity between the coast and the interior. And, of course, we saw Tunisia's revolution begin in the interior. And I think, unfortunately, we haven't really seen, this disparity addressed significantly up until now. 4 years on, the sort of, very dramatic, levels of dramatic differences in the levels of education and opportunity, basic infrastructure, and economic opportunities is quite stark. And so also I think for the United States, it's most natural and easiest for us to engage in the capital, particularly in a country where there are some security concerns. But I think it's so important that the U.S. make a stronger effort to engage and reach the interior with its economic support and economic programs. I also think on the economy as well as in the other sectors, it's so important that the international support and U.S. support be accompanied by encouragement and perhaps pressure, but not antagonistic pressure, sort of friendly pressure to help ensure that the Tunisian government is taking some of the tough steps that it really needs to take itself. And so our support on the economic side must be really accompanied by pushing the Tunisian government to take much-needed economic reforms that can create economic opportunities for new actors in Tunisia, that can help kind of move away from the old system under Ben Ali, which was dominated by a small core of corrupt elites that were close to the old regime. The same is true on the security side. It's very important that our security assistance to Tunisia be accompanied by efforts to help the Tunisians undertake serious security sector reform. I think again, we've not really seen the reform of the security sector that's been needed over the last 4 years, and I think again this contributes to the failure of the security sector to be able to adequately prevent the kinds of attacks that we've seen this year. On the sort of third component, the more political component in terms of democracy and governance, I think that there are lots of things that are needed, some of which I think are being provided adequately. I think it's very important to provide technical assistance to the Tunisian government ministries and government institutions that are trying to make the transition from being part of an authoritarian state to part of a modern democracy. It's also very important to support a lot of the actors outside of government, including civil society and also political parties. And in both of these areas, I think U.S. support and international support more broadly for both civil society and political parties has been a little erratic. And in Tunisia, prior to elections, there has been kind of strong efforts to help ensure that parties can participate in those elections. And then after the elections, we've seen kind of diminished support. In terms of civil society, there was also sort of very heavy push to support civil society that was kind of election focused. There was a strong push to help civil society engage in the constitutional processes when the Constitution was being written. I think what we need to see is a kind of longer term looking, more sustainable, steady approach to continually building the capacity of political parties and civil society, not only just at key moments such as elections and constitution writing. And I think we have seen some of the consequences of the kind of low levels of development, for example, of political parties. Nidat Tunis, the party that swept the parliamentary and presidential elections, is frankly a very weak and kind of loosely organized party that just came to be shortly before the last election, and after the 2011 elections. And I think it's important to help, continue to build the capacity of these parties, which I think would position them better to govern once they're in power. I like to comment a little bit on, we heard earlier from Bill about the Senate appropriations bill not granting the level of assistance needed. I would join Bill in sort of criticizing this move from the Senate. Of course, it's not final. We saw, as was noted, the administration's request for Tunisia's for bilateral assistance to Tunisia in different categories. The total request this year for fiscal year 2016 is $134.4 million. That's just over double what the administration requested 1 year ago. And first, I would say that I think that's a very positive sign. And it was also a very positive sign that the House Appropriations Committee, when it released its bill, fully granted this request. And I think that was, and the House also included some very strong, very welcome language, about the importance of Tunisia's democratic transition, and sort of went out of its way to specifically, endorse the administration's full request, not just leave it to the administration to pull those funds if it so chooses. The Senate Appropriations Committee granted, $86.9 million, about $50 million short of the $134 million request. As Bill said, I mean, this was not the result of opposition in the Senate to support for Tunisia, not on the surface. I mean, it was, it's really the result of kind of internal domestic politics and kind of discussions about, reluctance to, grant increased funding, except in, certain very specific areas that have clear support or have sort of a clear champion within the committee. And this has been the kind of line that the Senate committee has been putting out, or that you hear from the Senate since this decision was taken. But I would, kind of push back a little bit and criticize this. I mean, the Senate has said, we've heard from multiple Senate offices that there's really not the funds to be able to have many increases in international affairs in the state and foreign operations appropriations budget. But the reality is that there are many increases that the Senate did grant, and I think that there are lots of places. For example, on the foreign military financing, the administration requested $62.5 million. The Senate only granted less than half of that at $30 million. It's hard for me to believe that the Senate couldn't find an additional $32.5 million in security assistance for Tunisia. I could suggest perhaps reducing Egypt's military assistance from $1.3 billion to $1.27 billion. And which would be a very minor increase without lots of negative impact, and it would be taking away from a state that frankly is moving very much in the wrong direction, and would be able to fully grant a request the requested kind of doubling in security assistance for Tunisia. I could point to a whole host of other places in which the Senate actually granted funds in excess of administration's requests. One of those areas is scholarship programs. I'm, of course, in general supportive of scholarship programs, including those to the Middle East, and I myself participated and got part of my education on a U.S. government scholarship fellowship program in the Middle East. But having said that, the Senate granted about $100 million for scholarship programs. I think some of those, could have been granted in line with administration's request rather than in excess. I think the reality is that a lot of the places where the Senate puts earmarks are places where perhaps some of the educational institutions that benefit from these programs have lobbyists here in town that kind of push and they have their champions. And I think it's a shame that Tunisia's extremely important a transition was not able to find a champion in the Senate. Of course, this is not a final decision. By the end of the year, probably by December, we'll see the House and Senate versions, resolved, and we hope that the final version will come down more in the direction of where the Senate is in granting the administration's request. Finally, I'd like to just note a few areas of concern. While I've been encouraging there to be stronger U.S. support for Tunisia, I mentioned I think it's very important to see this accompanied by kind of urging of the Tunisian government not to take negative steps and urging them to undertake the kinds of reforms that I think have been largely overlooked or kind of put off up until now. And there have been a few different sort of alarming and concerning steps that have been taking place lately in Tunisia, largely in reaction to the most recent terrorist attack in Sousse. And I think it's very important that Tunisia gets support from the international community and that Tunisia hear the message that we're with you and we support you in your fight against terrorism, but it's so important that your fight against terrorism not include any rollback of the progress that you made in democracy. And I think it's important to note that the support that we do see here in Washington for a doubling of assistance to Tunisia from the administration and support on the Hill, I think the main driver of that support is the promise of Tunisia as a model. And if Tunisia starts to stray or take back some of the gains that it's had in terms of democratic rights and freedoms, I think there's a danger that they would see the international support begin to diminish. Three sort of concerning measures that I would point to. We've seen a newly proposed amended draft counterterrorism law. There was a counterterrorism law proposed last year, but it was never passed by the parliament. It's been sort of proposed again, and I think there were some real concerns with the draft that was put forth last year, including an overly broad definition of counterterrorism that could be used to define nonviolent peaceful demonstrations of political expression, including protest, as terrorism, and that people involved in these protests could, according to the draft law, face penalties including life in prison for taking part in protest if they were to, for example, block traffic or disrupt government services. And I think that's problematic. The new proposed law also includes an extension of the time in which detainees can be held without access to a lawyer or appearing before a judge or being given any charges up to 15 days. And I think that's those are dangerous moves that we should hope will not be passed by the Parliament. I've heard from our Tunisian contacts and colleagues that I've been in touch with, including this week, that there's a real fear that some of these measures are just going to be passed by the Parliament without serious debate and without serious opportunities for civil society and for the citizenry to engage. And this law is being debated this week, and there's a lot of concern about it being pushed through. Another area of concern is the declared state of emergency that was declared on July 4th. I think it's very positive that there's a provision in the Constitution that could only be put in place for 30 days, but those 30 days will soon be up, and I think it will be very important to not see this state of emergency be sort of renewed in a routine way so that it becomes part of the permanent landscape. And the third thing I would point to would be the proposed law on reconciliation in the economic and financial sectors. This law has been viewed as very controversial within certain circles, including a lot of the pro-democracy actors in Tunisia, and this law appears to threaten to undermine a lot of the kind of slow but steady progress that's been made on transitional justice. This law appears that it would give kind of blanket amnesty to many of those that benefited financially from corruption during the old regime. And it also threatens to kind of undermine the independence of the Transitional Justice Commission that was set up and kind of make it sort of subservient to the government in a sense. And so I think these are the kinds of measures that in a sense are often the reactions to incidents of violence and terrorism, but it's very important that we, as an international community in the United States, accompany our support for Tunisia, which I'd like to see increased, by a strong message, strong encouragement that their fight against terrorism, which we're with them on, should not include kind of rollback of the democratic rights and freedoms that have been gained in the last 4 years. Thanks.